Hello. Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to be here for our second in-person lecture this year. We've done a lot of remote lectures and not so many in person, but hopefully we're moving back into the space. Thank you, everyone, for coming. For those of you who are not from Cranbrook, I'm Gretchen Wilkins. I'm the artist in residence for the architecture department, and we're thrilled to have Peterson Rich Office here with us tonight for a lecture. Peterson Rich Office is a Brooklyn-based architecture and design firm. I can't see the light, sorry. Recognized for its cultural and publicly engaged projects at multiple scales. Founded by Miriam, Peterson, and Nathan Rich, who we have with us tonight, in 2012, the firm's early work included an artist studio, excuse me, for the Tula Telfair, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, and flagships for Perriton and Glossier in New York City. Peterson Rich Office specializes in cultural projects, especially for the visual arts, and in affordable housing. The lecture tonight will discuss how these two very different types of design work overlap and influence one another in their practice. They have been selected to design the Library Street Collective's new project, The Shepherd, located in the east side of Detroit. We're, of course, all excited to hear about that. Some of their other works, for those of you who may have heard of some of these, are the Davison Art Gallery at Wesleyan University, art studios for Nina Chanel Abney and Zaria Forman, a bookstore and community space on the Lower East Side in New York, a retail space for the Row in Nordstrom Fashion Valley, and several New York City Housing Authority properties. Earlier this month, PRO completed the Mandala Lab at the Rubin Museum of Art in New York City, an immersive cultural and healing space for adults and kids alike that brings 5 installations to help visitors identify difficult emotions and offer pathways to develop calmness and connection. We're so excited to have both of you here, and I want to also thank John Patrick, who's, I can't see anymore, but he's here too, from his practice above the fold, who offered this lecture to us and also is helping to organize it. So thank you, John, so much for your help with that. And everyone, please join me in welcoming Miriam Peterson and Nathan Rich.
Thank you so much. It's great to see everybody in person, live in an auditorium. We're thrilled to be here. And thank you, Gretchen, for that wonderful introduction. We want to thank Ben Cook also for his help and getting us sort of acquainted and settled here. And John Patrick, I also want to really thank you for this opportunity in setting this up. I also want to acknowledge Anthony Curious and JJ Curious from Library Street Collective who are here. We're going to be talking about the work. And they also really have helped us get settled in this town. We're excited to be here. We're going to sort of talk about some of our older work as well as some of our recent work, and Miriam and I are going to kind of bounce back and forth on the mic. Hopefully that works. This is our office. We're based in Brooklyn. There are about 12 of us, all designers. We work very collaboratively in a big space. And we kind of like to start talking about our work by showing the people who really make up our team. Because Miriam and I, as well as being business partners, are also life partners. We're married to each other and have a family together. And everything we do in the office foundationally is kind of based in that sort of that collective. So that includes, obviously, each other. It includes our team, of course, and it also includes all of the various clients, consultants, and people that we collaborate with. So we do a pretty wide range of things. Gretchen mentioned some of them in the introduction. We do artist studios. We do, which is all the way on the left. The sort of green image is from the recent Mandala Lab in New York at the Rubin Museum. Glossier. Retail project in the middle, a multi-unit housing project, second from the right, and then the Perrotin Gallery all the way to the right. We do a wide range of things, but we kind of see all of these things as part of a network of relationships, overlapping ideas, and also networks of people and organizations. So this diagram here, which is something that we kind of keep up and regularly update, is a representation of all the projects that we've had going on in the office going back to 2014. Gretchen said we started in 2012, but the first 2 years were kind of quiet. So the spine in the middle of the diagram are some selected projects that we've been working on for the past 8 years or so. And the arrows kind of shooting off of them represent some of the various collaborators involved in those projects. Those include consultants, they include clients, they include other designers. And as we kind of try to break down the various types of projects that we've done, they really kind of start to fall into two camps. There's work in red that we would call publicly engaged work. So Gretchen mentioned projects, for example, with the New York City Housing Authority, often research-based projects that are fully engaged with issues, economic issues, social issues facing the city. In yellow are cultural projects. So these include things like artist studios, galleries, university works, small museum projects. So projects that fully engage the arts. And over the course of this timeline, there's, starting at 2014 all the way on the left side of the image up to 2022 now, there's been this kind of ping-ponging back and forth between these two different types of projects. And one of the things that we've started to see happen as the office has developed, especially in the last few years, is this sort of ping-ponging is slowing down, and instead of there being these kind of two separate tracks in the office, these two different types of work are starting to come together. And the people that we're working with, the nature of the projects that we're working on, are both projects that engage the arts, like all of these yellow projects that I was talking about, and then also projects that engage sort of issues related to the city, development, social issues. And so the lecture, we're going to talk about, let's say, 5 or 6 projects. The last 2 are really one. And it sort of goes back and forth between these two different tracks and then ends on the projects that we're doing here in Detroit, which really bring these two different lines of inquiry together.
Okay, so our first commission project was a painting studio in Lyme, Connecticut for an artist named Tula Telfair. The site was rich with history, located along the Connecticut River here with beautiful views of the water. And the site itself had served many functions over the years. It was originally the ferry terminal for Lyme, so the main house had been the terminal building. There's a beautiful boathouse floating above the water, and several other structures that have been added over the years to create a kind of loose courtyard. On one side, the Connecticut River, on the other side, a protected wetlands, and the owner and artist had asked us to design a studio for her in this beautiful landscape. We had both come from past work experiences. I worked at Todd Williams Billy Chen for 5 years, Nathan at Stephen Hall, and so we had really spent our careers working on buildings of 100,000 square feet or more, large complex teams of architects inside and outside of the office, spending many, many years working together to coordinate drawings, to start construction. And we were confronted with this kind of perfect little building that we would design and draw and oversee the construction of completely on our own. But we really hadn't done much with timber construction. And when we were thinking about building a new building within this context of the existing historic structures, it was clear to us, for reasons of both budget but also kind of practical reality, that it would be a stick frame building. So we started by studying kind of rural barn buildings and historical working buildings within the area, went to barn building books, some do-it-yourself home building manuals, and kind of dug deep into timber framing and all of its wonderful possibilities. The plan for the building itself is very simple, really built around the working style of the artist, who works on several paintings at one time in the round with a single large palette at the center. So the studio is in that square space there, very tiny bathroom, a small office and library to the left. And the asymmetrical hip roof really frames the workspace in the highest volume of the building, coming down in scale at the back where her office and library are located. Her work is actually really fantastical and beautifully photorealistic landscape paintings. And despite the beauty of the surroundings, she wanted no windows out into the actual landscapes around her to distract from her focus of work. So the only openings in the building are these two full-height door and window as you enter, which frame a view of some river birch trees in the distance. The building is kind of pure in its materiality and form. The base is a blackened cedar, and the roof an anodized aluminum roof that reflects the sky. So it kind of relates to the landscape around it. It's set in a floodplain, so there's a simple deck that wraps the entire structure and allows her to walk around the building without getting into the grasses. Lyme, Connecticut is named after Lyme disease, so it was important for her to be able to be in the landscape, but also safely. What's strange? Lyme disease is named after Lyme. Yeah. Anyway, the detailing of the building kind of equally reflects the purity of the volume. This ribbon on the outside of the blackened cedar is translated into white working walls on the interior. The way the roof comes to an edge is expressed as thinly as possible with the overhang of the timber framing. And here's the interior of that studio. So something that seems perhaps simple actually involves quite a lot of effort on the architect's side to detail and consider how everything comes together. One of the most amazing things for us, having watched Tula work now over, I guess, 8 years in this building, is that the creation of this workspace for her has really facilitated a new level for her own artwork and her creative practice. So for us, it felt very much like a collaboration. Of course, we collaborated on the design, but we feel as though architects of this space, we really facilitated her own creative practice to take on new legs and to go to places where it hadn't gone before. The next project, kind of shortly after completing Telfair Studio, we were given the opportunity to have a fellowship at the Institute for Public Architecture. And this was right on the heels of our recently outgoing Mayor de Blasio published his housing plan, which had ambitious goals for creating affordable housing in New York City over what would be his 2 terms. At the same time, the New York City Housing Authority, for those of you who've been to New York, probably recognize some of these iconic buildings. It's so big that Nycha, which we call it, is often excluded from major city plans, which is kind of ironic since Nycha actually houses the most needy of all New Yorkers. So we like to kind of open up this with a couple of key facts about Nycha. Nycha is actually the largest landlord in North America, housing over 600,000 residents. The population of Nycha is larger than the city of Miami and Atlanta. Also, Nycha's tenants are employed by the New York City Police Department, the Department of Education, and Nycha itself. And so really, the city supports Nycha, but the city also runs on Nycha. So simultaneous with the mayor's recognition of our need for affordable housing, Nycha itself finds itself in need of major capital repairs. Over the last 2 decades, Nycha has been defunded by both the federal and state governments, and with deferred maintenance plans, this was already 6 years ago, needed $31.8 billion just to revitalize its existing housing stock to bring it up to decent standards of living. So when you look at how Nycha has categorized its capital needs, structural and architectural upgrades, systems, apartments, interiors and kitchens, sites and grounds, while it is a financial problem, it is also very much an architectural problem. So just going back to Nycha's buildings for a moment, characterized by towers in the park, mid-rise brick buildings. I would say that the architecture of Nycha is almost as iconic to New York as the Empire State Building, but in its sort of ubiquitous nature throughout the city tends to fall into the background. When you look at Nycha in New York City, these are 3 different neighborhoods. The one on the left is in Brooklyn. The one in the middle is on the Lower East Side, East Harlem, and the one on the right is on the Lower East Side. It encompasses sometimes several blocks or a decent percentage of a neighborhood. And what makes Nycha so different from the rest of New York, which is dense, lacking in open land for development, Nycha is fairly open. So the blue in these plans represents open space. The red represents service level parking, which is also kind of an anomaly in New York. So where the mayor was looking for opportunities for housing, Nycha was looking for money and had ample space to provide sites for the mayor's ambitious agenda. So if you look at all of the entire kind of inner ring of New York City, this is just a map of all of the Nycha campuses and a tally of all of the surface level parking on those campuses, which when you take it together is about 20 million square feet of area, or 2/3 the size of Central Park. Nathan and I often ask ourselves in our practice, who are we serving? What are we in service of? And I think through our work with Nycha, we've recognized our ability as architects to be visual communicators and to really distill sometimes complex and contentious ideas into palatable visual materials that can then be communicated to many audiences and really garner support, but also provide kind of grounds for conversation and consensus building. So these were a series of drawings that we made for 9x18. 9x18 is the dimension of a typical parking space. And this drawing just simply illustrates how that same dimension, which any resident can walk outside into their backyard and see and physically understand, could translate into new apartments, micro units, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms. And simple visualizations can begin to start a conversation and to empower residents in a discussion about how they might repurpose their backyards or what kinds of spaces they might trade for infill development on their campuses. This is just another set of images from parking lot to apartment building. And then likewise, when we presented this to resident groups, these kinds of drawings became conversation starters for how to negotiate new creative programming on sites and grounds, and also what kinds of buildings and places and other communities they might open up to welcome onto their campuses. As part of our final presentation for this fellowship, the New York Times architecture critic, Michael Kimmelman, happened by and had been interested in this topic, and so wrote an article about our research piece for the New York Times, which then facilitated what would have been probably maybe a simple summer research fellowship into a whole line of projects and relationships with city agencies, with Nycha residents, and with Nycha itself that has continued over the last 8 years, and we'll talk about a little bit more later. The next built project is for Perriton, New York, an international art gallery. Again, just to kind of contextualize it within the city, Chelsea, which is the neighborhood where most of the art galleries are located, has become, I guess, mostly residential development. So a lot of the galleries are losing their leases and looking to move other places. They found, with our help to some extent, the Bekenstein building on the Lower East Side, which had been a fabric company. But like a lot of things on the Lower East Side, which is mostly full of old tenement buildings, the building had been broken up into a lot of different apartments over the years, including the ground floor, which was 4 different retail spaces when we started working in the project. What is most unique about this building is that the 3rd floor has the highest ceilings in the entire building, 20 feet high. So ideal for a contemporary art gallery, especially one that houses a whole host of different shows, sculptures, paintings, multimedia. So just to show the floor before, part of the work included infilling an existing courtyard to maximize the floor plates for contemporary art. This is just a section showing the before. You can see a skylight down above the second level on the street. And so we filled in the building on 2 levels and created a new gallery on the 3rd floor with 20-foot ceilings, 65 feet wide. I think going back to Telfair, where we dug deep into timber framing, this building had an outdated mode of construction, so steel purlins and terracotta flat arches, which provide both a robust and strong floor that can carry heavy loads, so also ideal for an art gallery, but also provided fireproofing for the steel structure. One of the things that is unique about this particular structural system is that while it's robust, once you undermine one of the existing terracotta arches, you end up having to kind of remove the entire area, so it fails. So we had to very kind of surgically understand the existing conditions of this building in order to transform it into the art spaces that the client required. So part of the strategy, the architectural strategy, was a kind of, I guess, an expression of these arches, using the steel purlins as the basis. And so what this does in this detail section is provide an indirect lighting strategy, where each floor is lit completely consistently, as though by daylight, but each of the bottoms of the arch can be attached back to the steel purlin to provide hanging points for sculptures up to 3,500 pounds. And the whole thing becomes a kind of grid or system of infrastructure to provide all of the necessary elements of a fully functioning gallery while providing unique architectural identity to the space. So one of the things that's been really interesting for us in seeing all of the numbers of shows that have been installed here over the years is that with each type of art installation, you really see the space anew and in a totally different way. From large-scale sculptures to a smaller show with small sculptures and wall-based works, to video projections, to sort of traditional painting shows on the bottom right. Part of the sort of material palette was the introduction of plate steel, which finds itself in several places of the gallery. We unified the facade of the building with a new plate steel facade that would stand up to the robust brick above. It becomes a wrapper for the entry desk and book display. The one stair that connects all 3 floors, I think has 16 tons of plate steel, and becomes a place both for lifting works but also displaying art. And one of the things that for us I think is most important and exciting about Perriton in New York is that it's 20,000 square feet allow them to host museum scale shows. So the inaugural show was a Murakami exhibition comparable to a show that had recently been at SF MoMA. But unlike SF MoMA, the gallery is free and open to all. So no $25 admission ticket, but there were lines around the street, and fans came from all over to experience this artwork. So it becomes a very public place. And there's also a bookstore, which has smaller artist prints and makes the experience of engaging with the art something that can be more accessible to more people. This is just a last image showing the facade of the building. They had a JR show a couple of years after we completed the project and installed a giant sculpture man climbing on the front of the building.
Okay. So in the narrative of going back and forth between the cultural projects and the sort of publicly engaged projects, I'm going to talk about a publicly engaged project that we completed really last year as part of a fellowship with the Regional Plan Association, which is really a think tank and a policy-based organization in New York who had made public housing in Nycha one of their major initiatives for 2019 and 2020. So we had sort of an endowed chair to revisit some of the work we had done in the past with the RPA. But it being several years after we had done some of the research that Miriam presented as 9 by 18, a lot of things had changed. What's interesting is that the Housing Authority had actually started to look at these parking lots and started to issue RFPs to developers to build on them. So the idea that we had sort of started to work on really got some legs. We weren't the only ones working on it, but it really picked up steam. And so this was, for example, an RFP site that they had presented at the Baruch houses. You can see it's based on this sort of Corbusian tower in the park model, and there's all this space. Same here at the Sotomayor houses, and again, the red represents the site that they RFP'd. So what happened is that developers made proposals for these things. It went public, but residents really pushed back on what had been proposed. Reason being that for residents who lived in these developments, the priorities weren't building new developments on some of the empty land, but were instead the fact that their own buildings were leaking, had poor heating, elevators were breaking, boilers were breaking. Something like 90% of people in 2018 who lived at Nycha had lost heating at some point. So they basically said, here's a new development happening on our site, but what's it going to do for the problems that we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis? And they were able to file class action suits in certain cases against some of these developments. So this is on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. A development had basically been approved by the city and was slated to start construction. Design was done. Residents filed suit, and they stopped the development only 2.5 years later. So this was a problem. And Nycha, who had a major interest in getting a lot of these developments done because they needed to generate revenue, the city needed to create more affordable housing, had to change up their strategy for how housing was going to get done or any new construction was going to get done on their sites. And at the core of that strategy had to be the existing buildings and serving residents. So we were engaged in this process through our work at the Regional Plan Association, and we had the opportunity to tour a lot of campuses. So we kind of started on the ground. This is us on a number of different sites with our team, but also with sites with superintendents, with tenant association presidents, with people from the Housing Authority, people from the city. And we were also able to host a series of workshops with resident groups to sort of start really putting design ideas together based on their input, our expertise. And what was fascinating about this as architects, and Miriam brought up the question of who we serve, is it was a completely different context in which we could sort of practice doing our work and utilize sort of design thinking and design skills with a different group of people than we normally serve, but also in a very different context than we normally work. So there was a massive cafeteria with, I think, 8 tables and 120 people, and we were all gathered around these tables on plans that we had drawn and sketching and modeling together to start to generate ideas for some of these sites. It's a fascinating process and very sort of, as architects, I think, very sort of encouraging. And so some of the ideas that emerged through this process were that rather than these developments that targeted a single site on these massive campuses for a large-scale development, what if we could come up with strategies that are far more integrated, development strategies that included the existing buildings, the spaces, and the spaces in between the buildings? And so we sort of framed this 3-pronged approach to new construction at Nycha that included preservation of existing buildings, reprogramming of empty spaces in buildings to better serve residents, as well as new construction. And we sort of tried this out at one particular development that's in Brooklyn called the Cooper Park Houses. About 650,000 square feet, 1,500 units. There's, interestingly enough, a massive amount of development rights on these sites because there's so much space in between them. So really trying to think about all of these different variables and how it can serve both development goals but also resident needs. And so we started with sort of the most baseline of resident needs, which is heating and cooling. And we looked at how residents are currently served heating and cooling. And like I said, in a lot of cases, these steam systems and boiler systems fail. And so one of the things that we heard most from residents is, how can we get reliable heating and cooling? So we proposed to use a straightforward electrical mini split system, and then started to, from there, unravel ideas of how it could impact everybody's day-to-day lives beyond just the heating system itself. So for example, looking at a bedroom space, once you remove a steam radiator, once you remove a window unit air conditioner, it suddenly opens up some additional space in a very cramped apartment. It also lets more light into the apartment. And so then from there, some more ideas start to roll. So instead of we had to find places to put the condensers, for example, for the mini splits. And this was during the time of COVID. So this idea of privately accessible outdoor space was sort of on the front of everybody's mind in New York City. Unfortunately, we're not privileged to have yards and things like that in most cases. It's so dense. So we proposed to put those condensers out on balconies that were affixed to the sides of the buildings. And those balconies also served as an additional thermal barrier to better insulate some of these buildings. The rooftops were an opportunity as well. So once you've established these new balconies, there was a major initiative at Nycha after some of the major flooding events we've had in New York City to bring infrastructure from the basement of the buildings up to the roofs. And so we said, well, what if you created an infrastructure layer on the roof of the building and you expanded it with solar panels up on top of the roof? It protects the roof, it protects all the equipment that's been moved up there, and it starts to create a new space for residents and for the people that live there. And so this idea of trying to take a multi-pronged approach to development at Nycha, new construction, preservation, and reprogramming, started to take some shape on these existing buildings. So this is an existing ground floor at the Cooper Park houses in Brooklyn. So what you're seeing here is all empty space. So it's underutilized with effectively just empty dirt floors in some cases that when the buildings were built was just sort of left over. The only utilized space here was this sort of entry into a very small lobby and then an egress out the back with a ramp. Additionally, there was parking all along the street here that kind of cut off Nycha from the rest of the city. You know, as Miriam showed in some of those diagrams, New York is incredibly dense and active. Parking like that really becomes a barrier between the Nycha and the rest of the city. And the housing, or the entry into the housing, is set back very far from the street. So imagine an elderly resident having to come with groceries and having to walk a long way to get to their entry. So the alternatives that we proposed had to do with really activating those ground floors and then expanding on them. So in this plan, what you're looking at is taking over a lot of that empty space for new apartments and for new accessible lobby spaces at the fronts of the buildings, for new package rooms, new laundry rooms, all the things that we were hearing from residents that they wanted. The apartments that we were adding were studio and one-bedroom apartments, which currently don't actually exist in public housing. It was all built after World War II. It was based on the nuclear family, 3-, 4-bedroom apartments that don't necessarily serve resident needs now. So here in these plans, you can see how those extensions worked out. We used this little trick of just having the extensions kissing the buildings, which enabled us to avoid having to follow setback laws and to treat these as extensions on the existing buildings. And then those extensions became a way of stitching the campuses to the streets that surrounded them. So rather than these buildings that were pulled back from the streets, that became almost, where the space in between became almost a moat around the campus that really isolated people that were already kind of isolated by virtue of their economic position. These new extensions were ways of stitching these developments and therefore the residents back into the surrounding urban context. And so when you look at the breakdown of units, in black are the existing unit breakdown at Cooper Park houses. So it's 60% 2-bedroom apartments, 14% 3-bedroom apartments. Like I said, no studio apartments and very few 1-bedroom. So with this new sort of development, the breakdown shifts and you get more smaller apartments to better serve the needs of a 2020, 2021, 2022 population. So this is what it looks like now with this sort of parking barrier, empty ground floor spaces. And the proposal was to utilize these new developments, these new extensions as gateways into the campus to create a more welcoming and friendly and brighter and lighter sort of threshold between the development and the rest of the city. So the last project we're going to talk about, which we're excited to share and talk about, especially here, is the one that we're working on in the East Village with the Library Street Collective. So we call it an arts campus because there's actually a number of different pieces and parts to this development. The campus itself, for those who are familiar with the neighborhood, is sort of typical of that part of the city. So it's one of these neighborhoods where there's just been decades of attrition, people leaving, and in the 90s and early 2000s, I'm sure a lot of people know much more about this here than I do, but the city was basically taking down buildings that were there because they had been condemned and had become dangerous. And so what was left over was all of this green space. And so our clients who are here tonight, Anthony and JJ, started by purchasing this incredible building called the Good Shepherd Church that was sort of at the core of this neighborhood. And then over time started to collect a series of parcels that are adjacent to it, that were sort of typical of this sort of empty green space. And what's exceptional about this site is you have an institution that had for a very long time anchored this particular neighborhood as obviously a religious institution. It was a Catholic church, and I think it was in the the early 2010s that the congregation had left. But the building, as you can see, this is sort of the way it looked a few years ago and still looks, is in excellent condition. So this site has this institution, and then it's also got housing. So it's this incredible foundation for generating a neighborhood that's multifaceted and multi-programmed. And it makes sense for this particular client because for those of you who are familiar with the Library Street Collective's work, they work in a lot of different scales and in a lot of different ways. So everything from spaces like the belt all the way on the left to activations and events, traditional exhibitions in the gallery spaces that they have, and then also sort of creating public programs. Like this was a coloring book they created in public schools here in Detroit. And so as we started to develop the building, it had to hold up and develop the site more generally, but I'm going to start with the building. It had to hold up to this sort of multifaceted approach to work and to all of this different types of programming. So that starts with the site. We worked with the landscape architects, OSD, on a site that has a lot of different programming on the exterior. So it includes sculpture gardens. There's a Charles McGee sculpture park here, spaces for exhibitions sort of scattered around the site, a skate park that the Library Street Collective is working with Tony Hawk to develop, and then a large lawn space for events, and then the church itself and the adjacent rectory building here. And those public spaces, these are images by the landscape firm OSD, are going to be activated with a variety of types of program that include a cafe that you can see here in this picture, incredible gardens and landscape, and then here's the Charles McGee Sculpture Park. As we go to the inside of the building, our sort of approach was to make, this building was in such incredible condition that we really wanted to take a light touch on the building itself. So this was one of our early study models, and what you're seeing in white is the existing building. In wood are the insertions that we were making in kind of a surgical way, much like some of the strategies we were using on Perriton in this sort of incredible artifact of a building. And the concept had to do with what we call complementary contrast. So taking things that are new and inserting them into this building that was old and had this traditional character to it to kind of reinforce and improve upon those traditional characteristics. So the new really making the old look that much better. So this is a detail from, a section detail from inside the building. And so as we go into the plan, what you're looking at are these sort of insertions into the building. So a new lobby space, for example, here with this entry desk and a piece of millwork that leads into an office space here. A large new gallery space here with an opening in the top that frames views into the old building. Access to the top of that gallery space by a feature stair and a new elevator. So really creating new spaces inside the church that didn't previously exist. Another smaller gallery space, large space for performance, a stage for performance or large-scale sculpture. And then we're working with an organization based here in Detroit called the Black Arts Library on a space here that'll hold their archives and become sort of a resource for the community. So, like I was saying, an organization that works in a lot of different ways and a building that will support all of those different ways of working and all of those different types of work. So to take you through it a little bit, the exterior of the building remains more or less intact with a new sort of halo entry around the front of the building, just to kind of signal that something new is inside, but to really preserve this incredible artifact. And as you enter the building, a new lobby space and desk that sort of resonates with some of the original terrazzo floors and incredible details of the space in terms of color and tone. These new sort of walnut thresholds and bookshelves behind. And then as you enter the major church space, you're greeted by this major feature stair. So this sort of spiral stair, it's actually an arch that references the arches that you start to see throughout the building. You can see one of the original stained glass windows behind the stair here. So starting to create these formal relationships where new and old start to work together and reinforce one another and talk to one another. And that stair, as you can see, brings you up to a bridge that takes you to the top of this gallery box here. from which you can look down over the church space and experience different events in the church space. Inside that first gallery space, there are framing views up to the top of the church, as well as through the building to the back of the church space, where you can see some of the original windows of the space, some of the original lighting of the space. Utilizing new lighting strategies throughout that don't compete with the original stained glass windows, for example, but instead sort of create sort of localized light for these specific types of program. So this view here is looking towards the Black Arts Library and their archives, where we've created these sort of study carrels and nooks where people can actually utilize the books and go through them, maybe listen to records, and we bring down this large light fixture to sort of change the scale of experience within that space. And then a view looking back towards that first gallery box, from which you can look down over the rest of the church space. And there's this material resonance that we're trying to create between some of the original stone detailing and terrazzo detailing in the space and the new materials that we're using on the side of the building. These are micro toppings of concrete, metals to resonate with the original capitals inside of the space, new guardrails with lighter, obviously, detailing than what you would have seen in the past. But again, this idea of complementary contrast really showing throughout. So then, to step back outside, as I mentioned at the beginning, this neighborhood has all of this green space, and part of the project are these assembled parcels that are adjacent to the space, where now that there's an institution that's under development there, and I'm happy to say that we're going to see some mock-ups tomorrow for the church space, there's the question of how you can start to build a neighborhood around that institution. And so as we started to think about these sites, there it is in the middle, this kind of E shape, we started by looking at the adjacent neighborhoods, the East Village, the Marina District, Indian Village, to understand some of the essential housing typologies and building typologies that exist in this part of Detroit. Using that same sort of research-based approach that Miriam talked about at the studio and at the gallery, where we look into the histories of these areas. We also did here. So, you look at these traditional building types, it's familiar suburban style development, detached buildings set back from the street with individual driveways and front walks, where, as anybody who's lived in those circumstances knows, you have a very private experience of driving home from the street and don't necessarily get to know the people that live around you. So in trying to create a new neighborhood in this area, one of the things that we decided to try to do, working with the clients, is to try to create shared spaces. So to try to create new typologies of collective living in this semi-suburban context. So instead of individual garages, for example, shared parking along sort of a central new sort of street. Instead of private entries into the buildings, collective entries to the buildings from the center of the site. And so we created 5 goals and ambitions for this development. The first was, we said, porosity with the neighborhood, so an openness to the surrounding context, so that it wasn't a closed village or an enclave, but instead one that started to generate new activity around it. The second was community through shaped space, so this idea that I talked about of the openings to the buildings actually facing inward, so that there were collective zones where people would get to know each other, experience one another, unplanned interactions with your neighbors. Some private outdoor spaces for individual residents, and you'll see some of the artist studios that are going to be in the development. Flexible ground floor space for those studios and for some commercial activity to sort of bring different types of energy at different types of times a day to the neighborhood. And then lastly, economy of construction and affordability was essential so that you could really serve both some of the residents that were living there and broader populations around the city of Detroit. So this was our early study model of the development. We decided to create a series of detached buildings, which was at scale with the rest of the context and neighborhood. Multi-unit buildings, but no more than 3 or 4 units per building, and a variety of different types of openings into the development that serve different types of purposes. Another one of the characteristics that we really wanted to draw out that exists in the neighborhood now are these incredible trees. One of the features of sort of all of this green space is that the trees have been able to thrive, and a number of them are in excellent condition. So we did an analysis along with some of our engineers of which trees were in great shape and were worth preserving. And we went through all of them and started to basically identify the ones that could help start to shape our plan. So which trees could we preserve to sort of help enliven the character of the neighborhood? And how could the buildings take shape around them? And so the plan really did start to develop based on this concept of different types of openings to the streets, based on types of shared spaces, and based on the locations of the trees. Obviously, a very strong relationship also to the church, so I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail. So in terms of how they relate to the surrounding context, you can see here there are openings that go between some of the buildings. There are larger openings between separate buildings, smaller openings that form small alleyways and entries to create sort of like a very dynamic elevation on the street. And then to sort of, rather than creating a barrier of parking, like we were talking about on the Nycha site, there's a private, or there's a semi-public drive that goes from south to north across the site, through which residents can access shared parking clusters. Again, another opportunity for neighbors to get to know each other rather than pulling up to their individual driveways. And then that notion of porosity, and there really being lots of different entry points across the site to the surrounding context that are shared entry points and shared walkways. So again, places where people might get to know each other, and also ways of enlivening the adjacent streets. This is a view of the model sort of looking at that street there, where you can see that sort of shared parking, one of those shared parking clusters, and its relationship to one of the neighboring courtyard spaces surrounded by these four buildings. So really trying to create a very dynamic set of relationships between form and open space parking. And along those lines, a series of courtyards that open, rather than opening towards the street, open towards this sort of semi-public street at the middle. So really trying to create a feeling of enclosure, but also shared spaces, these sort of C shapes as you work your way up from south to north. Inside the development, one of the things that we've tried to do is extend the eaves of the roofs 4 feet to create a feeling of coverage, something that we've seen sort of actually just in walking around the campus here. That's incredibly important on a day like this in Michigan, but that also really creates a feeling of enclosure as you walk through the site, and a feeling of almost it being like a village or a neighborhood. The programming also supports this idea of it being a village. So everything in pink that you're seeing here is going to be artist studio space. So the ground floors of these buildings are really being activated by people that would also overlap with the programming inside the church. And this came out of a lot of the relationships that the Library Street Collective has in the city, and a need that they recognized in the city. There's an incredible desire in Detroit and a lack of studio space. So this is a place where we could sort of activate these ground floors with studio spaces that could be visible from the outside to start to create another sort of overlay of community in the development. And then really at the core of the site is this public space facing off with the church where commercial programming or retail programming, commercial or food and beverage programming would open up onto this sort of plaza to really activate it. So you can imagine how this space could reinforce an event at the church. Let's say that there's an opening or a concert that happens in there. People could spill out across this new walk, down the stairs at the front of the church, across the street onto this new plaza where there might be food and beverage programming to sort of support them there. And a zoom into that moment of like density of activity, density of planting. You can see the presence of some of these old trees in the development. And a view looking back towards the church from the inside of the development. And the last point, and we'll sort of finish here, is this question of affordability and economy of construction. So we've been working with a couple of different organizations that prefabricate walls and wall systems, one based in Toronto, another based in South Dakota, who are kind of right now competing for a role in the project. But the idea is to create this sort of place, this active place, this energized place through really economic construction means. And what we're looking at are these sort of prefabricated wall systems for doing that. And we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'd be glad to take some questions.
you're working with a church, and you're doing, I mean, excellent job with all your projects, but in this last one, and you were talking about how to put the community together and trying to give them a place to become friends, almost. And I cannot stop thinking about, you know, the old Europe where the spot for the community, it is in front of the church with steps, and usually there's a plaza right in front of it, which is not cut from the street. Do you think it will be an idea to, you know, maybe rework the urban arrangement and the street, you know, cut it off and try to use the space in front of the church for maybe outdoor concert where people can use those steps to sit and put some more strength in that X that you're creating?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the goal. And you might have seen in the plan diagram, one of the ideas is to potentially extend the material from the plaza space across the street to the base of the church steps to create that feeling of connection. I'm not sure if we could close off a city street, but the idea is to create that kind of space that where the church, instead of it being this religious institution based around religion, becomes this institution based around the arts, but starts to perform in the same way as European churches might have.
Absolutely. And another thing that I want to point out, I am very glad to see that someone is using those technology in New York in the other space where you use the archway and terracotta, which is very European as well. And so thank you, and great job.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Someone else?
Who would be able to live in these buildings, these apartments that you're building? That's my question. Who would be able to live in these apartments that you're building? And
I
is
mean,
it a City of Detroit project?
It's a
Or-
private project.
It's a private.
But the idea is that the private project can serve a really broad population. So part of the idea of the economy, really using economic means of construction, of creating different scales of units, is that there could be a mix of affordable and market rate units so that you can really have a mix of different types of people there.
I'm about halfway there. I can get actually a little louder. I'm a professor and I'm a teacher, so you want me to use it anyway? Okay. So I am Victoria Bell, adjunct professor at Lawrence Tech. You don't know about it, but everybody else here does. But I'm in the College of Architecture and Design. So my question is, I know that it's privately financed. The Library Collective actually took over from Matt Eaton way, way, way back in the day. And Matt Eaton, they're good, it's good family friends and whatnot. So my question is, like, is all of this solely being financed, this construction, the whole thing, by themselves? Or are they getting some type of, like, DAFs or like community trust funding to like support all of these different programs, foundation funding, or is it just solely with them?
I'm not going to go into detail about it, but there's a mix of different opportunities and funding sources, particularly around the housing. Okay.
I would like to talk to those guys because Matt's out in California with Tristan right now. If possible afterwards, because I'm looking to do a similar development, but around like makerspace technology, that whole other realm outside of arts and design. So my nonprofit Concrete Oasis got a Ford Foundation Award around a financing theory that solves for construction, community development, as well as double-digit ROIs for investors. So I would love to have a deeper conversation around all of that. Thanks.
Thank you for that presentation. I had a question about the Nycha housing and what the future of that looks like, and also the feasibility and the timeline of a project at that scale.
Yeah, well, Nycha at the moment is seeing a kind of once in a generation infusion of money. So we're working at the moment with the Housing Authority, basically to work with Nycha, but also with Nycha residents to establish site-specific ideas for sites and grounds, upgrades, creative programming, upgrades to buildings. And so a lot of the work that we showed in the RPA is work that we're now undertaking with Nycha as part of their RFP process. So as architects, we're not necessarily seeking to be the authors of the eventual construction projects, but rather working with Nycha and Nycha residents to help frame the problems. And in issuing the RFPs, which are going out to developers, to rehabilitate the buildings, to do sites and grounds improvements, energy modifications, kind of basically retrofitting Nycha's buildings to hopefully last and serve residents for another 100 years. They're now undertaking sort of step by step the process of doing important renovations. And one of the sort of fundamental criteria that Nycha has established, which we feel is really important, and I think we didn't mention but was fundamental to the premise of both 9x18 and also the RPA work, that any new construction project or any new residents that would, show up on a campus, that project would be paired with meeting and exceeding all of the physical needs of the host campus. So Nycha is really at the very beginning stages of overhauling all of their many different campuses in New York City, currently through a kind of partnership with a private developer, but hopefully eventually Nycha will actually undertake some of those retrofits themselves. Thank you. Yeah. Which, by the way, 8 years ago when we first started working on this seemed kind of like a pipe dream, but now actually is beginning to happen in earnest.
Yeah, I mean, the previous speaker might be interested. They've basically unlocked ways of being able to borrow money against the value of their land and to partner with private developers and private money that they otherwise hadn't been able to do in the past. It's taken a long time to be able to get there because as a public housing authority, they were limited in the kinds of capital they could access. They were reliant basically on government money. So that's changing a little bit, and it's really changing the landscape of what they can do.
As a follow-up, does that change how much does that change with different mayors that come into New York, knowing how much
Well, yeah, not to be too in the weeds about it, but one of the issues that we've learned about, which is not specific to architecture, but public housing is funded through Section 9, which is just a kind of legal access to money. One of the ways in which they're able to unlock borrowing power is by converting the rental vouchers from Section 9 to Section 8, which is part of the federal funding program. And has, for whatever political reasons, become the more preferred way of delivering affordable housing across the country. And so the private developer partner and construction partner renovates the buildings. The residents then go from Section 9 to Section 8, which just unlocks a kind of more steady and reliable funding stream for rental subsidy. They do it through a public RFP process, so I believe that they have a longish list of pre-approved development partners who basically have proven themselves to be, financially solvent, and then they undergo a kind of lengthy process. We kind of initiate the resident engagement during the pre-RFP process, The outcome of that informs the RFP, and then once the selected team is awarded the project, they continue with their own resident engagement process after that.
Hi. I came in a little late, so hopefully I didn't miss something super important. But I've been trying to kind of make a connection between the two projects that have been presented tonight and trying to see if I could tease out a question from it. And one thing that I was kind of trying to tie into with this project that's happening here in Detroit in the East Village is, though it is a kind of a private development project, have there been any workshops or outreach to the surrounding communities that you're implicating to kind of influence the project that's going on?
So one of the slides that we ended up taking out, and I don't know what the text looks like, it was corrupted, is a list of the different organizations that have been involved and sort of contacted throughout the process. This is just sort of a partial list who the Library Street Collective and their collaborators on the ground have worked with and engaged, including us. So the project has incredible support from the neighborhood, and I think the reason for that has been this sort of engagement process and the slow engagement process of talking to people, talking to what they might need, talking to various stakeholders in the neighborhood.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you.
Me and JJ feel okay about that.
About